Jason Miller's beloved hedge was destroyed overnight, leaving his sanctuary in ruins and his sense of security shattered. The culprit, Karen Whitmore, the ruthless HOA enforcer, acted with cold authority, imposing her will without regard for Jason's effort or property. But Jason refused to back down. He rebuilt the line as an unbreakable Cinder-Block fortress, turning her intimidation into his opportunity. Just wait until you see how this clash of stubborn wills unfolded, and why justice ultimately triumphed in a way no one expected. Jason Miller had always taken pride in his little slice of suburban paradise. On the edge of his property, bordering the quiet cul-de-sac, he had spent countless weekends planting, pruning, and nurturing a hedge that had grown into a thick, vibrant wall of greenery. It wasn't merely a hedge. It was a shield. The dense foliage softened the sounds of passing cars, blocked the view from nosy neighbors, and created a private retreat for him and his young daughter, Emma. Every leaf, every carefully trimmed branch reflected hours of care, and it gave him a sense of control and comfort in a neighborhood that often felt too crowded, too exposed. For years, the hedge had grown in harmony with the house and the garden. Birds nested in it. The sunlight played along its top in shifting patterns, and in summer its cool shade became a sanctuary. Jason loved that hedge almost as much as the little wooden swing set tucked behind it, where Emma spent afternoons reading, swinging, or simply daydreaming. This green barrier was more than landscaping. It was part of his life, an anchor that kept the outside world at bay. That sense of calm vanished one morning, like smoke in the wind. Jason had just poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the patio, expecting the usual comforting sight of his hedge lining the property, glistening with morning dew, but instead he was greeted by a shocking scene. The hedge was gone, or more accurately, reduced to ragged, uneven stumps. The thick, vibrant wall of green he had cultivated with care now looked like a battlefield, a line of chopped wood punctuated by scattered leaves. Standing amidst the destruction, pruning shears in hand, was Karen Whitmore. Her presence seemed deliberate, almost theatrical, as if she had staged this moment to maximize its effect. Karen was notorious in the neighborhood as the uncompromising HOA enforcer, a woman who wielded rules like a weapon and delighted in asserting authority. Her expression was unreadable, yet there was a smirk that made it clear she considered her actions a moral victory. "It was overgrown," she said flatly, waving the shears toward the remains of Jason's hedge. "It violated the neighborhood aesthetic." Jason blinked, struggling to process the words. Overgrown, aesthetic violation. The hedge was in perfect health, meticulously shaped and aligned. His mind raced in disbelief. Did she not see the countless hours of sweat, patience, and devotion that had gone into creating it? Did she not consider the sanctuary she had destroyed? Anger surged through him in a tide he could not contain. It wasn't just irritation. It was the raw, almost physical sensation of injustice. How dare she decide the fate of his property without asking, without warning, without even a discussion? It was audacious. It was humiliating. It was cruel. Every fiber of his being rebelled against the sheer audacity of someone stepping into his life, his space, and dismantling a piece of it, as if it belonged to them. Jason's hands tightened into fists at his sides. His jaw ached from clenching. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, a flush of indignation that made his heart pound. Karen, standing there with her smug expression, seemed oblivious to the humanity of her victim. She treated his home and his efforts as though they were nothing more than objects to be corrected. That thought fueled the fire within him. Neighbors began to peek from behind curtains and across fences, sensing the tension but unsure what had happened. Jason's gaze swept the cul-de-sac. Some faces were sympathetic, others curious, but none of them could undo the damage. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just a simple HOA disagreement. It was personal. It was an assault on his life, his labor, and his sense of security. He took a slow, deep breath, trying to contain the storm inside him, though the anger continued to ripple outward in waves. This was not a minor slight. It was a blatant injustice, a public declaration that his efforts, his space, his boundaries were up for arbitrary destruction. And as he stared at Karen Whitmore, still smirking with that infuriating self-satisfaction, Jason knew one thing with crystal clarity: he would not let this go unanswered. This hedge had been his shield, his quiet refuge, and now it was gone, but the fury it sparked in him was just the beginning. The first crack had formed in the foundation of peace he had built in his life, and it would not be repaired with words alone. Something had been taken, and Jason was already planning how to reclaim it. The anger burned like wildfire, unrelenting, and it would drive every decision he made in the days to come. Days passed, but the sense of loss did not fade. Jason Miller awoke each morning to the same stark, barren line along his property where the hedge had once stood. The green protective wall that had given him comfort and privacy was gone, replaced by jagged stumps and scattered leaves that seemed to mock his efforts. Every glance out the kitchen window, every step into the backyard reminded him of what had been taken. It was more than landscaping. It was a wound, raw and persistent, and it seemed to ache deeper with each passing hour. At first, Jason tried to convince himself to move on. Maybe it was just a hedge. Maybe he could plant something new, something better. But even that thought was heavy with frustration. He had dreamed of restoring the greenery, yet the idea of starting over alone felt impossible. Replacing the hedge with cinder-blocks, something stronger, something immovable flickered in his mind as a solution. But the thought of hauling, mixing, and laying them himself was exhausting. The task seemed monumental, like climbing a mountain with bare hands. Meanwhile, the neighborhood became a constant reminder of his humiliation. Karen Whitmore, with her reputation for strict enforcement and petty control, had not gone unnoticed. Some neighbors openly supported her, nodding approvingly when they passed by. Finally, someone taking care of that overgrown mess, one neighbor said casually. Completely unaware of the months of care Jason had poured into the hedge. Their words stung, twisting the wound deeper. He felt both isolation and betrayal, as though the community itself had turned against him, siding with someone who took pleasure in enforcing arbitrary rules. The small joys of home no longer carried the same warmth. When Jason tried to enjoy a cup of coffee on the patio, the empty line along the fence drew his eyes. Even Emma, his daughter, noticed the shift. One afternoon she tugged at his sleeve, her small voice trembling with confusion. "Daddy, why would someone do that to our hedge? Why would they be so mean?" Her innocence pierced him. He realized that the hedge had been more than a barrier for him. It had been a shield for her too, protecting her from the view of strangers, the noise of the street, and the prying eyes of adults like Karen had always mattered. Now even that protection was gone. Jason tried to explain, to reassure her that things would be okay, but words felt hollow. Each conversation, each attempt at comfort only underscored the helplessness he felt. The pain wasn't just aesthetic. The hedge had been a symbol of control over his own property, of autonomy in a world that often seemed obsessed with rules and appearances. Its destruction was a violation on a deeper level, a reminder that his home, something sacred to him, was not entirely his own. He wandered the yard, touching the ragged stumps, tracing the lines where leaves once brushed his hands. He remembered the mornings he had pruned carefully, shaping each section so the hedge would grow straight, the evenings spent coaxing new shoots to flourish, and the satisfaction of watching it mature into a living wall. All of that effort, all of that care had been erased in a single moment, replaced with emptiness and a lingering sense of injustice. Even simple interactions became painful. Small talk with neighbors now carried a subtle undercurrent of judgment. Their eyes lingered a little too long, their smiles a little too knowing. Jason could feel the weight of their assumptions, that he had been careless, that he had let the hedge become overgrown, that he had somehow invited this humiliation upon himself. Every glance, every whispered comment drove the point home. The hedge was gone, and with it, the safety and respect he had once taken for granted. At night, Jason lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the ache of helplessness gnawing at him. The injustice of the act, coupled with the sense of isolation, left him hollow. Yet beneath that hollow space, a quiet ember of determination began to stir. He didn't see the way forward yet, but the injustice, the violation, and the pain were not enough to extinguish his will. The hedge was gone, but Jason's spirit, though bruised, was beginning to recognize the scale of the fight ahead. Pain was a heavy burden, but it was also the first step toward action, the spark that would eventually light the fire of resistance. The violation of his sanctuary, the betrayal by a system meant to protect, had left a scar, but scars he knew could become a source of strength. Jason Miller refused to let the weight of injustice crush him. The hedge might have been destroyed, but the fire inside him remained unbroken. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the neighboring rooftops, casting long shadows across the stumps and scattered leaves, he stood at the edge of his yard, surveying the remnants of what had once been his sanctuary. The sight was sorrowful, yes, but it also sparked something sharper, a determination that could not be ignored. He would not allow Karen Whitmore or anyone else to dictate the boundaries of his life or the meaning of his home. If she wanted to control him through petty rules and arbitrary enforcement, he would respond not with confrontation alone, but with ingenuity and resolve. Jason's mind began to map out possibilities. The idea of planting another hedge seemed fragile, too slow, and too vulnerable. Instead, he envisioned something solid, something unmovable, something that could stand as a physical and symbolic assertion of his autonomy. The thought of a cinder-block barrier began to take shape in his imagination. Unlike the hedge, it would be permanent. It would communicate strength without words. It would be a declaration that his property, his labor, and his peace were not up for arbitrary judgment. But hope alone would not build the wall. He needed knowledge. In the days that followed, Jason immersed himself in research. He read about local building codes, dug into HOA guidelines, and learned masonry techniques he had only ever glimpsed on home improvement shows. Each discovery fueled his resolve. Every paragraph of regulation and every instructional video reinforced a simple truth. He had the right to protect his space if he followed the rules. Knowledge became empowerment, and empowerment became a quiet rebellion in itself. Jason's quiet planning did not go unnoticed. Slowly, neighbors who had watched the hedge incident unfold began to approach him in subtle ways. Some offered moral support, nods of approval, sympathetic comments about Karen's overreach. Others quietly lent their skills. Within a week, a small group of neighbors had volunteered to help, bringing wheelbarrows, cement, and tools. Their presence was a revelation. He was not alone. The hedge's destruction had sparked a collective desire to stand against arbitrary control, and each person contributed not just labor, but encouragement, camaraderie, and determination. Work began in earnest. Each morning, Jason and his neighbors carried cinder blocks across the yard, laying them carefully along the line where the hedge had stood. Each block was more than a building material. It was a statement of defiance, a piece of reclaimed territory. With every layer added, Jason felt a growing sense of agency. The anger and pain that had dominated him began to shift into a forward momentum, a recognition that he could shape his environment, that he could reclaim what had been lost, one deliberate action at a time. As the wall grew, so did his confidence. Karen's smug presence, once so intimidating, no longer held power over him. She might scowl from across the street, issue warnings, or wag her finger with authority, but Jason had discovered a force she could not control: knowledge, preparation, and the quiet support of a community that recognized fairness and respect. Each brick laid was a reinforcement not only of the physical barrier, but of his personal boundaries. Every completed section of the wall became a symbol of his resilience, a visible declaration that injustice would not define him. By the end of the third week, the cinder-block wall had taken substantial shape. Jason stood back, wiping sweat from his brow, and felt something he hadn't in days: hope. The barrier was sturdy, precise, and resolute. It represented more than protection from the world outside. It embodied his refusal to be controlled by arbitrary rules or petty enforcement. He could see it clearly. He was no longer reacting to the injustice inflicted upon him. He was shaping his response, reclaiming agency over his life and his property. Hope flickered brighter with each completed section of the wall. Jason realized that this project, born from loss and anger, had transformed into something profoundly empowering. The hedge had been destroyed, but from its absence a new form of strength had emerged. Brick by brick, he had begun to assert control over his space, his environment, and his future. And in that process, hope had evolved from a fragile idea into a tangible, unstoppable force. Weeks of effort, determination, and quiet rebellion had culminated in a sight that Jason Miller could scarcely believe when he first stepped back to observe it. The once empty, wounded edge of his property had been transformed into a cinder-block fortress. Solid, precise, and formidable. Each block, carefully laid with patience and care, fit together perfectly, forming a continuous wall that rose higher than anyone could have imagined when he first envisioned it. The hedge's absence, once a source of sorrow and vulnerability, had become the foundation for something stronger, enduring, and unmistakably his own. But this was more than construction. It was symbolism rendered in stone. The fortress was a statement, a tangible manifestation of resilience, autonomy, and the refusal to allow arbitrary control to dictate one's life. It stood as a monument to the principle that a person's home, their labor, and their sanctuary were worth defending. Every brick reflected not just Jason's sweat and strategy, but the collective spirit of a neighborhood quietly rallied behind him, united by respect, fairness, and shared indignation at an overbearing system. Karen Whitmore, the notorious HOA enforcer whose actions had sparked the initial conflict, finally appeared on the scene. She stormed down the cul-de-sac with the kind of urgency that only authority obsessed with control could muster. Her face was taut with frustration, her steps quick and purposeful. She had brought her usual arsenal of warnings, fines, and admonitions, fully expecting them to intimidate or dismantle Jason's work. But when she approached the fortress, her expression shifted from confidence to disbelief. Jason didn't shout, argue, or react with anger. Instead, he simply smiled, a calm, assured smile that carried the weight of weeks of labor, thought, and unshakable resolve. He gestured lightly to the structure. "All built to code," he said softly, matter-of-factly. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line as she surveyed the wall, realizing that her authority could not penetrate its solid construction. The rules she wielded so aggressively were powerless against preparation, knowledge, and perseverance. Her intimidation, once so effective, had been rendered irrelevant by Jason's careful planning and unwavering determination. As word spread through the neighborhood, admiration replaced the usual gossip. Neighbors, once hesitant or unsure, now nodded with quiet approval. Children who had been curious from a distance now played safely behind the fortress, free to run and laugh without the unease that had lingered when the hedge was gone. The structure wasn't just a barrier, it was a safe haven, a visible declaration that Jason had reclaimed both his property and his peace of mind. The transformation of the hedge into a fortress had sparked something far greater than personal satisfaction. It became a story whispered and shared, a tale of ingenuity overcoming intimidation. Neighbors began to see that standing up for their own spaces and principles was not only possible but necessary. What had started as a cruel injustice, an arbitrary, humiliating act that stripped Jason of a cherished part of his home, had evolved into a demonstration of human resolve. The Cinder-Block wall embodied a lesson. Injustice could be confronted, challenge could be transformed into action, and setbacks could become catalysts for remarkable achievement. Jason's triumph was not merely in bricks and mortar. It was in the reclamation of his autonomy, the restoration of his sense of justice, and the reaffirmation that calm perseverance and strategic action could overcome the seemingly insurmountable. The anger he had felt at the Hedges' destruction had been channeled into a purposeful response. The pain he endured had been transformed into momentum, driving him toward a constructive, tangible outcome. By the time he watched the sunset paint warm light over the wall, Jason felt a deep sense of fulfillment and peace. The story of the hedge-turned fortress spread beyond the cul-de-sac. It inspired neighbors, friends, and even casual observers to recognize that resilience was not just a personal quality but a shared strength. Jason had turned personal injustice into communal inspiration. The once trampled hedge line had become a monument to patience, ingenuity, and courage. In reclaiming his home and dignity, Jason had also sparked hope in others. Proof that even in the face of petty authority and unreasonable control, determination and action could triumph. What began as an act of aggression had become a story of empowerment. Jason Miller had built more than a wall. He had built a testament to human spirit, a fortress that would inspire, protect, and remind all who saw it that injustice could be overcome one deliberate step at a time,